Welcome to our virtual meetup. As you may recall, we used to meet once a month in person, and thanks to COVID, that is within quotes, we have been meeting more often, and thanks to the generosity of experts such as Sean, who is willing to share their knowledge and expertise with our group. We truly appreciate that. In terms of logistics, it's very simple. All of you are going to be on mute throughout the duration of this presentation. If you have a question, go ahead and use the Q&A button. That's the easiest way to ask a question. We can also manage the Q&A effectively that way. But you can also send a message on chat, and we'll try to get to that as well. So those are the two options for asking a question. Feel free to send a question while the presentation is on, but Sean will take them up once he's done with his presentation. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sean Smith. Today's topic is Influence, the Digital Artwork of Artificial Intelligence. It's an intriguing topic. I did not ask Sean what he's going to cover because it's an exciting topic for me, and I want to keep it that way myself. Influence, the Digital Artwork of Artificial Intelligence. Sean Smith is a Director of Success at Data Robo, where he supports development of actionable intelligence with automated machine learning. Sean has held multiple positions in advanced analytics and machine learning with some of today's largest technology companies, such as Dell, AMC, Oracle, and startups like Endeca and BigSquid. That's very impressive. Sean is a contributing author to Towards AI. You may be familiar with that. It is a top artificial intelligence publication in Medium, where Sean shares a forward-looking digital influence guide for AI. Sean is best described as an expert leader who greatly enables business acceleration through the use of advanced analytics and AI. Sean has a science degree from the University of New England and has studied as a graduate student at Harvard University. Once again, today's topic is Influence, the Digital Artwork of Artificial Intelligence, and I'm very pleased that Sean Smith is with us today. Thank you, Sean. It's all yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, and thank you everybody for joining with us this evening. I'm going to pull up our slides here so that we can talk through it. So again, my name is Sean Smith. I wanted to cover an interesting topic with you this evening called Influence, the Digital Artwork of Artificial Intelligence. And while we all see the details and the insights that come from artificial intelligence, I believe that there's a forward-looking view, something not so distant in the future that's going to come from what we're doing today. And I'm happy to share some of the thoughts and details, and I think it makes for a great discussion to have with not only your team members that are very familiar with machine learning and data science, but team members that aren't. If you want to reach out to me, you can hit me up at any of the different addresses here, swsmith07@gmail or LinkedIn or Medium, and I'll show you some of that here. So a quick overview of the agenda to get us started. Again, high-level discussion, early discussion to introduce you to some new topics. First off, as an introduction, my background and experience, we kind of covered that, which was great. Again, I'm a success director at Data Robot, automated machine learning company, artificial intelligence company. I've worked with lots of different organizations. I currently spend a lot of time with financial service organizations as well as healthcare organizations, and we've gotten a whole bunch of different ones, especially with what's happening with COVID nowadays. I do publish these materials, and a lot of what you're going to see here has been published on Towards AI. It's under a topic called the Digital Influence Guide for AI. And so this is actually the first segment of that entire setup. And we'll actually go through and talk a little bit about this concept of influence and how it works with artificial intelligence. We'll take a step back then and understand about your analytical maturity, or how you and your team members understand that. And what you're going to see is that you're probably not very far off from what we're expected, but your organization may be, or the organizations that you work with. And so there's an interesting piece to start to compare that and see those different behaviors. There are some things that become incredibly challenging when we have these business intelligence dashboards. We'll talk a little bit about these epic failures, I call them. And essentially what it is just kind of overconfidence in some of those situations. So a good warning and a good way to grow and expose the insights that we give. We'll continue on talking a little bit about artificial influence and helping learn how we can look way down the road and start to organize things in a sequence of events to be able to help drive them forward. And then last but not least, we'll talk a little bit about the journey ahead. So with that, happy to step into the first topic. One of the challenges that I see, and I spend all of my time talking with both customers as well as team members, as well as family, friends, colleagues about artificial intelligence. And we typically see these advertisements that come on TV. One of my favorite ones is the Microsoft advertisement that has the comedian that steps on stage. I believe his name is Common. He's an actor and a comedian. And he's on stage with a band behind him. He's celebrating this idea of artificial intelligence and how powerful it is. And so one of the things that we get from that is, well, what really is this? And I believe they go into on some of them, they go into one where they show some images of snow leopards and how they've helped with snow leopards. And it's very passionate and it's really well done. However, we want to know what's behind the curtain. And we want to really understand what we can do with this. And so as you can see down here, my personal disclaimer that I would tell you is that artificial intelligence is our attempt to support in some way, shape, or form an actionable influence that we don't have to participate in. That's where the value comes from it. You know, they always say if there's a tree that falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it actually fall? Well, same thing here. If we can't actually use the technology and the tools that we embed across our organization to be able to influence an outcome, then what good is it? And I also added here that quite simply, we can now operate with confidence in these tools and these actionable influences in the maybe area. And so when we typically think about choices or decisions that we make, there are times where we're absolutely confident in our decision. And there are times where we have to come to a certain conclusion with maybe not so much confidence. Well, artificial intelligence and machine learning and these tools help us start to operate in the maybe area when we're not around. So if we look at that and we start to understand, well, if we want to shift interest out in the future towards this influence and changing influences, there's some interesting correlations that happen. So a long time ago, an economist by the name of Adam Smith highlighted in several of his works how there is this item called an invisible hand. So he talked about it early on in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759. And he said how an individual's self-interest promotes unintended social benefit. And he termed this an invisible hand. And if you remember from early illustration of my presentation here, you saw a bit of a juggling act. And what was feeding that juggling act was an artificial hand and basically the challenges that it might have on that invisible hand. So in a free market economy, you can go out and you would get improvements on what you either bought or sold. You'd have to improve products for people to be able to consume them. You might have to bring prices down, and then consumers, because of their free market action, would be able to help drive prices down. You can see this, the best place I love to talk to people about where you can see this right now, and we've seen it for years, is if you have a cell phone in your hand, you pick up that cell phone, take a look at it. That's a great example of how we're constantly driving to get either a new every two deal or a free phone or a cheaper subscription or more data. The cell phone companies have been constantly doing this. What's interesting, as it mentions here at the bottom, is with the advancement of artificial intelligence, the conditions that are stemming from freedom of choice and the communal best interest may be on the verge of being shifted to someone's or some organization's desired interest. So this invisible hand and this free market economy and how everything would be driven down now all of a sudden has something that's actually influencing that outcome. So what I believe is starting to happen is that there's a new discipline that will emerge from this. And it's a discipline about influence architecture. A discipline that helps you use a series of tools, behavior, understanding in those behavior, to set up a sequence of events, just like these dominoes, that you can trigger in effect, essentially promoting what I would call a motionless means of interaction. So if I go out and I want to purchase a specific product, then there might be an incentive to do that. It might be that I typically go to Starbucks, but on a certain day, they want me to buy 2 beverages or grow my behavior. And so they're not essentially changing my course. I'm going there, I'm purchasing something, but they're starting to enhance it. So it's essentially not swaying them and motionless. So I believe that there are going to be team members out there with a title called influence architects. And what they're going to have to do is really understand both the technological implementation of artificial intelligence, the data, the distribution of that data, combined with the sequence of events that happen, along with the business process that they can utilize to influence outcomes. So currently, we go out and we build machine learning models and artificial intelligence models, and they help us decide whether or not a customer will cancel. This idea of customer churn. Well, the idea that's promoted here is that, well, I do want to know if this customer is going to churn, but I also want to know when they're going to churn. And then once I provide them a reason to stay my customer, I've completely changed that environment. I have to get ahead of that, and I have to understand what I need to do next. And so that's where you're going to see a sequence of events that help to drive the appropriate outcome that team members are looking for their organizations. And I believe that there are people that will emerge to be able to do this. I don't believe it falls in a specific data science bucket because it actually goes into a lot of business process. And I don't believe it lends itself towards just a business understanding, because you need to know some of the thresholds and whether or not the models will fit and how to sequence the models to be able to do that. So let's take that step back. Let's talk a little bit about this analytical maturity that we all have and that our organizations may or may not have, and see what we're typically used to, see what framework is out there, and figure out where to go. If I can move forward here. So the question I want you to consider is, what is your analytical maturity, you as an individual, as compared to what your organization's overall analytical maturity is? And what I think you'll find is that your organization is very far off. So here, this image that you can see where there's both a typewriter as well as a laptop. You can jump on both of them and you can type out a letter. Same effort. In the laptop, you're able to probably email it. You're able to connect to it. You're able to print it off with a separate printer, which is not something, obviously you can't email it from a typewriter. But the way these work tells us a whole lot about those two differences. On the left-hand side, that computer is a unit that functions all together. And in doing so, it allows you as an individual almost to keep that contained. Now, on the right-hand side, the typewriter here, when you hit one of those keys, it mechanically moves some of the pieces. And so you can think of this at your organization where you have an idea that a customer may cancel, and you need to go tell someone, like the account executive, that that customer may cancel. And once they understand it, they have to then go figure out from their sales manager or from the discounting center who's going to actually help you promote to continue to keep that customer. And so there's two very different things and two large challenges. So what is it we do at organizations, and how do we look at technology and artificial intelligence? So A while ago, Gartner published this analytical ascendancy model. What I would tell you is that I think everyone at every organization has probably seen this now. It is typically used as a standard to both evaluate technology as well as place technology in particular buckets to support that organization. They've actually subsequently come out with another model that kind of breaks this out a little bit more, a newer one that becomes, it's actually a bit more confusing. But it helps us understand how we go through this sequence of analytics. And so if you've heard it before, it talks about this idea of starting with what happened, this descriptive analytics, moves on to diagnostic analytics, why things happen. And then we jump into predictive analytics, what will happen. And then last but not least, if we understand something has a potential to happen, we want to be able to influence those outcomes with some type of prescriptive analytics. So how can we make this happen? And typically those prescriptive analytics outcomes get actually placed back into some of these earlier technologies and systems. And so for descriptive analytics, again, this is like our traditional standard weekly, monthly reports, typically coming out of transactional systems. We've then taken that data and put it into business intelligence systems to do the diagnostic. I understand why things happen, aggregate that to data. Predictive analytics is what we're starting to get into with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and be able to drive those outcomes. So your organization looks to this to be able to buy particular tools and technology and segregate data into buckets to do that, much like the mechanics of that typewriter piece and you working through with your different team members. But you, as an individual and your team members, you can do all this. And so I want you to imagine driving down the street. And as we jump in our cars and drive down the street to get a cup of coffee, we look way ahead in the distance and we can see a sequence of brake lights. We can see a light at an intersection. We can see some brake lights. We can see people kind of pulled over to the side of the road. And so we naturally go through this process in our head immediately. We say, well, what happened? Well, it looks like two cars may have gotten in an accident or stopped at the light. Well, why did it happen? Oh, I know this is typically a busy intersection. It looks like they're pulled over. There's a lot of traffic. What will happen? Well, if I don't slow down, I'm probably going to rear end someone in front of me. And last but not least, how can we make it happen? Well, I'm going to step on the brake and slow down. We do that instantaneously in our thought process, but our organization doesn't work like that. And the reason it doesn't work like that is because we typically don't have all the information that we need all at the same time. So there is a process to be able to distribute that information and utilize it across the organization. And partially what's been happening is that we're in this kind of phase of disappointment, right? We're trying to buy the technologies, we're trying to buy the tools, we're trying to stand them up. Historically, we've had data scientists that would go out, gather some data, be asked a particular question. They would try to build a model by hand, write some Python code, test it. They would get a scoring. Now we're in a position where we have these automated machine learning tools that run through hundreds of models to be able to tell us which model is the best fit for our data set. And truth be told, you don't know which model is going to fit your data until you run all the models that apply to that type of question. And so what we've seen is this kind of temporary disappointment, but I would tell you it leads us to this exponential positioning. And so as we're starting to go out and educate our team members, it's so ever important that we continue to educate our team members, not only the people that are doing the data science, but the team members that are doing business analytics and the team members that are reading those reports and those dashboards. Because as we start to drive predictive analytics information out to those endpoints, out to those business units, they have to actually understand where it's coming from. They have to understand what it means to them so that when we get to this point of chaos and amazement, it ends up being amazement as opposed to just chaos with data all over the place. So let's talk a little bit about where many organizations are in a point where they have business intelligence dashboards all over their organization, and that's how they essentially run their organization. Let's talk a little bit about how those are kind of challenging. So earlier we talked about the Gartner Analytical Maturity model. There is actually a pretty unique model out there called the Capability Model Maturity Index. And so the government has been using this for years to understand the behavior that an organization has, not as opposed to the technology or tools or the analytics, the behavior they exhibit, classifying them in a particular manner so they know how well they're doing, essentially, those analytics and pieces. And so if you look through this process, it starts off, it's 5 levels, starts off with this initial piece where these organizations, their processes are unpredictable, they're poorly controlled and reactive. They're not doing anything. The second one is managed. Processes are characterized for the projects, and it's often reactive. They're not proactive, they're reactive. Once they become defined, or in the third level, the processes characterized for the organization is starting to become proactive, and they're able to tailor what they're doing to the standards. Level 4, quantitatively managed. Processes are measured and controlled. So now all of a sudden they gain this sense of control to their organization where they can push and pull levers instantaneously to change what they're doing. And that's, last but not least, the top one is they're focusing on out in front process improvement. And so this represents an interesting detail of how these organizations behave. And I believe it's actually a better way for our organizations that we work with to look at how they manage their data, but more so how they behave with that data. Because if you don't have the behaviors, then you're not going to get to that place of amazement. It's going to be a bit more about chaos. The other piece that's unique is if you take these 2 different charts and diagrams, you'll notice that they fit well, very, very well together. So on the left-hand side, you can see where it says the bold C.A.M, that's Capability Model Maturity Index. That is the one on the top with 5 different levels. And then underneath that, you can see A.M, Analytical Maturity Model, or as they called it, Analytical Ascendancy Model. Those are the different levels there. So when we start to combine these, and basically what we're doing is we're taking our behaviors and we're adding data and technology to those behaviors. And if we're able to use them properly, we get the next level of behavior. So CMMI1, it's initial, we just witnessed something's happening. AMM1, hey, we have data. We can understand what happened. Well, if we witness something and then we have some data, we understand what happens. This is your transactional systems with reports. CMMI2, behavior as reactive. We're starting to inquire, hey, something happened. We want to know what happened. Let's look at it. And then AMM2 is essentially that information, the data, included with data. So if we take multiple reports and put it together, kind of like we aggregate data into BI systems, we can understand why things happen. The third level, behavior is defined. We know why it happened and we can plan for it. And again, data plus statistics will understand what will happen, and that becomes quantitatively managed. Now we can start to control these events, or at least put enough control around them, the pieces that we can control. And as you get later into this, all this data and information plus statistics, plus this key piece of operational pathways. So those workflows, how can we make it happen? How can we line up our dominoes in a particular sequence to continue to drive the best outcome for us? Once we put those together, I believe that there's an interesting way to reflect this. And so what I've started to highlight here, and while I don't know if this is the exact representation that would be the best, it's a great way to go through it. I believe that there's a method of thinking with this data And I call this a cognitive action model. And so these represent essentially levels of analytical maturity. You can see the descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, prescriptive. So the 4 different levels of analytical maturity. And then the details that happen in between. So awareness, engagement, we have an understanding, we have an expectation, and then we're anticipating the events to come. And all that builds based on evidence. And so I like the concept of this better as more of a target as opposed to a staircase, because as we talked about earlier, and as we kind of agreed, that our analytical maturity is much more about our thinking process and honing in on something, our target that we want to get to, as opposed to stepping up a staircase to the top. So as we get descriptive data and diagnostic data, we look to figure out what could happen next, and that becomes a very particular perspective for us to look into. So this type of representation helps us really understand if we're going to go out and we're going to make our business intelligence dashboards, we might want to give a sense of what analytical maturity is embedded inside of that dashboard. There are a couple items on the right-hand side that start to itemize kind of our pathway, and that's essentially our pathway of what we're looking towards for that target and our confidence levels that we get there. The steps represent the data that we start to get, the evidence that we start to get. The target is basically what we want to happen and what we want to predict. And the edge is this point initially where you just gain awareness and you start to figure out that it's something really important to look into. Interesting model. The goal is really to make decisions with more than just historical analysis, demand to see that information lineage. And information lineage needs to go well beyond just the data itself. It needs to go into the analytics, the level of analytics, and why those analytics are being done, what that focus point is. So if we take this, we might be able to put it into essentially a dashboard right along, as this shows, for an example, our retail sales analysis and the opportunity to influence that outcome. So here this is basically a mocked up diagram of retail sales. You can see sales per quarter that happens, upsell, opportunity with upsell prediction based upon that, some of the different details that we put in there. But in the top right-hand corner, this is that cognitive action model. And what it does is it shows on the outside all the data sets that we may have been pulling into this dashboard, the products that we have, the transactional data. And then when it steps into the next level, to the diagnostic piece, it says, well, we took some of the site logs and we took the transactional data and we analyzed that as essentially site traffic, what traffic was leading directly to kind of either upsell or what sales. And then that drove into an upsell model. And what we figured out was at this particular point in time, there was an upsell offering that would be the best to support this, and that was offering 6. So now I have traceability end to end from both the data that I gather to the data that I aggregate to the data that I build models against to what the best offering is. And you can imagine if this were all dynamic and you were able to filter on a particular customer or different customers, that diagram would update and change to be able to support that discussion. So last but not least here, a quick look forward. What I've found from some early keys to success, some of these sequence of topics, one, start now to focus on and even more so beyond ROI. So historically, we've gone out and we've done a really great job of trying to quantify ROI in order really to justify our technology spend. And so if you remember earlier from this discussion, there was that diagram that showed us our period of disappointment up into our period of amazement. We need to start to focus beyond that ROI into the opportunity to control the sequence of events that happen out in front. that drives even more ROI. So if you can do both, focus both on the value that you're going to get from the ROI, but also start to identify, when I build and put in artificial intelligent routines, how do I get to go beyond that ROI to control what's going to happen out in the future? Make those changes visible. The awareness of your organization to understand what's actually happening and how you're stacking up these dominoes is going to be critical. It not only helps them understand why those things happen, it helps to get them into a pattern of expecting those things to happen and even driving more value out back too. Invest in those team members. Spend time with your team members well outside of the technology team. The business team members that are out incoming, doing the day-to-day job, I've said for years that some of our best information comes from the team members that have been on that job for 20 years. And while they may have great insights or ideas as to where there's a problem in the organization, it may not be the exact answer or solution, but it gives you a great process to investigate, and you have an expert at hand. And then with the statistics and the machine learning models and the analytics, it'll actually tell you what the pieces are that's important. Evolve your conversations. On the right-hand side of this image here, you can see I have text called Area of Interest and Influence. We've talked for years about use cases. We need to go well beyond this concept of a particular use case. We need to talk about an area that we're interested in and how we can influence outcomes for that area. And if that area of influence is based upon our customer engagement, then we need to talk about all the use cases that fold into that area of interest and influence. So I would tell you that use cases are basically a subset of this big AOI example. What is it we're interested in changing, and how can we influence the outcomes? We talked earlier about this idea of the cell phone conversation, and if you call up the cell phone companies, or you switch, or even cable companies, you call some of these organizations, you say, that's too expensive for me, I need a cheaper rate or a cheaper plan. You, your family, your team members are all doing that same thing. And what they are doing is basically what the invisible hand is talking about. They're starting to drive down the price. And if you keep paying a lower price for what you're getting as the same service, the company either has to give you more value for what you're getting to drive the price up, more services, basically, or they're going to have to start to lower that price for everyone. And so it's really important that we understand that as we start to change elements out in front, we have to adapt to that and be able to understand the entire area that we're interested in and everything that we're influencing. Staying out of the weeds, technology people love technology, and I'm a technology guy, and I definitely like technology. But what I've learned is that sometimes that definitely takes us away from what's important. So staying out of the weeds means that you have to have a common discussion with more than just the technology team members or the data scientists or the people that are working on artificial intelligence. You have to involve the business team members. You have to have a common understanding across the different roles, and it has to go from an executive to the line of business team members, directors, managers, people that may or may not have any understanding about the technology that you're working with. Later in some of my writings that I have, I call it the thin, wide line. And the image that I have basically drawn up is this looking from the top, from above, from an executive level down between a business member and a technology team member. And between them is just a straight line. And that's pretty easy. They can reach across, they can shake hands, they can work together. But as you come down on the side of it to their level, and you look at those two team members facing each other, it's actually a wall. And sometimes that wall might be miles long. And they would have to walk around it to get to the other side to be able to work together, because they don't have the depth of knowledge from those two different sides. So last but not least, value the simple context. this idea of earlier when we talked about the commercials that are out there for artificial intelligence and the technologies and platforms to get people excited are great. But when people don't understand that to get a predictive model, it's as simple as asking a yes or no question or asking a how many type question, it becomes really challenging to help them understand what different use cases are. So we start to all of a sudden, AI starts to become a very unique method to be able to have use cases, and you have to have a tremendous documented, itemized detail based upon that use case. And people expect that it's really hard to do that stuff, as opposed to, hey, I just want to do a binary classification and understand what's the likelihood of my customer to churn. And that's a yes or no question. And so when you engage other team members to help them understand that simple context of we're just asking some yes or no questions and getting a rating based upon that, it drives that conversation so much faster. So one of the things that has helped me along the way, early in 2014, I had the privilege of running a marathon with one of my good friends. And what I found was that regardless of the training that you did, the training plans that you did, the food or the goose that you had, the plan that you had on race day, the shoes that you had, the socks that you had, headphones, whatever you were doing, there were some consistent things that popped out for me because everyone on that race day stood on the same line and had to run the race. And so these are some words that I carried that worked really well for that. And the first one was just pace at your speed. If your organization can go, a mile an hour, go a mile an hour. If they can go 10, go 10. Shorten your stride when the path is hard. If team members are having a challenging time with what you're doing, slow down. Take smaller chunks. If they're starting to get it even more, lengthen your stride when momentum carries you forward. Keep driving forward with it. Slow and stop to even rehydrate. Slow down, take a drink of water. If you need to, literally stop and catch your breath. Deal with problems along the way. You're going to have tons of problems that come up being able to do this. Always remember the end state, and it's always important. What's interesting is many of our sales conversations always have the discussion about the end state. If you get this technology, you buy this product, you're going to look like this in 6 months. And so we have to remember that end state. And finally, finish, finish, finish. So that's a good summary and overview of the art of digital influence. Happy to show you some of the additional details that are more to come. This was kind of an introductory session into all of that. The next section talks a little bit and walks through this idea of the journey ahead. We talked a little bit about this, navigating that thin, wide line between technology teams and business team members, how to negotiate it, how to build a tactical toolbox for your organization, and then really drive a metamorphosis across them. So these are some of the details. You can see a whole bunch of them at Medium. If you are interested in reading any of the articles that I have published in the first section, let me know, shoot me an email. I can send you, if you don't have a Medium membership, I'm happy to send you a friend link specific to the article so you're able to read that as well. And other than that, I'm more than happy to take any questions if there are.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Very, very thought-provoking. That's my first reaction to that presentation. Again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A button. If you really want to ask a question, I'll make you a panelist or unmute you so you can ask a question that way as well. With that said, Sean, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask you. Let me actually give you some kudos for the slides. They look pretty amazing. They came from an artist, looks like. Great job with the slides. So my first question is, you spoke about customer churn. And if you're doing any kind of AI, even analytics, that's one of the things that you have to do. And when you're talking about influence architects and customer churn, one of the things I thought about was immediately was, I don't even know if that is a thing right now, but it used to be what we used to call business process reengineering. So, is that something along the lines of what you're thinking when you're talking about influence architects? If not, how is it different?
Yeah, I believe it's definitely along the lines of that in a very similar context. I think the extension here, when I start to talk about this idea of an influence architect, is they have a depth of understanding into the pieces of artificial intelligence and the methods to be able to distribute models well beyond your organization's kind of platforms, right? So this idea that I could distribute a predictive model into someone's iPhone, and when it is in the iPhone, it has to operate independently by itself. And so it only should trigger for a very specific sequence of influence points. So the idea of how to break down the models and the influence across essentially all the different devices, technologies, or methods that we have to interact with people.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So the next question is related to the scenario where you spoke about somebody driving on a street, seeing a couple of cars pulled out on the side, naturally applying the brake, and then trying to draw a comparison with what an organization can do, and in most cases probably don't do very, very well at this point. So my question there is that really a fair comparison in the sense that some of the organizations are pretty large, making any kind of change, applying brakes or, pausing, changing direction can be a challenge, especially for large organizations. So how do you kind of reconcile the two things?
Yeah, I think, if consider the us driving down the street as an individual and being able to control everything on the car, and which obviously what you're referencing is that, I might control the steering wheel and my colleague might control the brake and somebody else might control the gas pedal. What I would tell you is that, these organizations need probably a much better alignment across them and a much better flow of information with thresholds to be able to understand when they should start and stop doing the things that they're doing. And so they should have enough context, much like the models that we put in place or the data or the dashboards. They should have enough context to be able to understand how to make that decision without essentially phoning home to figure out the details. So when we provide them this dashboard that says, hey, here's all your customers and here's what they look like and here's the value, and that dashboard only has one piece of information from the organization, think about the context of a customer calling into a call center because they have a problem with their environment, and the call center has no details about the sales reps or the engineers that have already been on site, right? That's the type of stuff that we need to make sure that we have together, right? The flags that basically say that this is what's happening, route this information properly.
That makes sense. And I'm going to follow up on that because it's a little bit counterintuitive when I think about it. Again, like I said, it's a very thought-provoking presentation. So it may take us a little while to perhaps go over it again and understand and, reflect on this. But the way I'm thinking about this is, if you take let's say that influence architect become a job role or a position or a title in an organization, right? There are people who are called influence architects, and that's their primary responsibility. So you would think that companies that can typically afford a new title or role like that are large companies. However, large companies tend to be really slow in making changes. Whereas smaller companies, they may not be able to afford influence architects, but they're more nimble in terms of their ability to make changes. So that's a contradiction that kind of in my mind. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's people in those smaller companies that are fully capable of doing that job or already doing that job or that role. I think from the standpoint of, and then in larger organizations, I think being able to hire someone, but giving them a particular piece of the organization to focus on is a good way to do it. In both cases, it's definitely going to be about documenting how these hundreds of thousands of employees in this organization behaves and how it interacts with either customers, either you name it, anything that it interacts with, and making sure that the 100 and the 100,000 employees all work like one employee with all of that information, and having that, and obviously the information out in advance.
That makes sense. I think we're really talking about a change in an organizational culture. So that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to ask a final question. Again, if you have any questions, last minute questions, please go ahead and send that to us via chat or Q&A. So thank you for sharing keys to success. I really like the way you went through that whole concept of the different steps. So the question there is there a recommended sequence for implementing those keys? I think there are about 7 or 8. I know you went through them in a specific order, but is it really, is there a sequence to doing things, or as many of them as you can?
Yeah, I think with how dynamic our companies are today and with how much we already have to worry about, it's about just doing them as you can and starting to, if you take a small step today and work on 1 or 2 of them, and as you continue to move forward, those small steps become bigger steps, driving that behavior. That's why I like that early diagram that really starts to highlight that there is a period of disappointment. There is a period of where you have to slow down and set yourself up for a very successful future. And I believe that some of those things are changing behavior is hard, right? We all try to change our behavior, whether it's, stop buying so many cups of coffee or drinking so much coffee or get more workouts in, or, you name it, right? Don't work as much type thing. That's all very hard. And what we've found is that if you can think about it, if you can talk about it, that's a great start. Once you start thinking about it, talking about it, promoting it, then as you do more and more and more of it, it just becomes natural to do.
All right. Thank you again, Sean. What I would like to do, with your permission, is publish your information, social media, and email, if you're okay with that, on our meetup group. And this will also go on our YouTube channel. So I would like to share at least your social media information there so people can reach out to you. Again, a very fascinating topic, very thought-provoking. We are usually not a quiet crowd, but like I said, it's deep. It was a deep topic, right? So thank you again, Sean, for taking the time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you at the next meetup. Let's give a virtual round of applause here for Sean Smith. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.